This is the third lecture on the topic of middle childhood. I want to just briefly go back just a little bit. I felt like I ended that too quickly and talk about or be a little bit more clear what some of these terms mean. So because human growth is really the application of so much of the stuff you got in psychology. In psych, we would have had you have a whole chapter on the discussion of memory, but it's important, I think, that you understand what we're talking about. So remembering that executive functioning is like the highest order of cognitive utility. It's the organizing of information. Working memory is the concept of where you bring all of the stuff. So there's this sensory memory and long-term memory, and working memory is where you use all of that information. And so it's considered, it's considered to be necessary in order for, well, it's all necessary for functioning, but that's how we use memory, is we use the working memory. Meta memory is a term that's actually not included in our psychology textbook, but it's the understanding of how memory works, and understanding that some things are easier to remember than others, that you can relearn things, but just understanding the whole concept of what memory is. But it's the mnemonic stuff that I want to talk a little bit more about what we mean. So there's a theory, or there's a strategy for memory processing that's called elaboration rehearsal. And elaboration rehearsal is simply making connections with something, elaborating on something that you're trying to learn. Rehearsal is using that information over and over again. Elaboration rehearsal is using that information over and over again in telling and creating a story. So it's a strategy that we probably all use, but the point is that a child's cognitive development can only be enhanced when they can learn to make connections. And this making of connections is partly possible because the way the brain has changed, right? Because the neural connections are something called memory traces, and that when you use the same neurological paths, when you think the same things over and over again, those connections become stronger. And there is some evidence that the stuff actually makes like traces, like you can actually see memory traces in the brain. I don't know, but anyway, that's what they say. Okay, so I want to make sure I went over that. This is a list of some of the various, what's referred to as the psychometrics. And psychometrics, oh gosh, I can imagine some people would find this really cool. It doesn't sound interesting to me, but I know people that it does sound interesting to too. And this is the measurement of psychological variables, things like personality tests and IQ tests. Specifically, that's what this slide is about. It's about the metrics or how we measure someone's intelligence or their intellectual capacity. And I'm not going to go over, but maybe these are familiar to you. Maybe if your children have been assessed or you were assessed as a child, you might be familiar with some of them. But the way I used to try to typically explain what these tests do is they attempt to capture the gap between what a child knows and what a child is capable of knowing. And if there appears to be this big gap, then it's said that there is a learning, I don't like the word, but they call it disability. In other words, this child is capable of knowing a lot more because according to the tests, right, according to these intelligence tests, they're highly capable of learning, or they're highly intelligent, but what we see performing in the classroom indicates that they're not getting it. So that's when a child might go into special education, is because what they're capable of knowing and what they're actually demonstrating that they know, there's a disconnect. The first one, for instance, suggests that it measures verbal and performance between 6 and 16. And so if a child demonstrates that they're highly verbal, but they're showing low performance, then there must be some gap in language. One of the criticisms of all of these tests is that they really don't measure intelligence. I mean, there's really no way to measure what a child wouldn't know very much, right, at 6, but rather it infers what a child is capable, or what a child will understand or can understand based on what they already know. So, but doing that, it would be profoundly challenging. your textbook does talk about something that I thought sounded interesting, and these are what's called dynamic tests. So going back to the chapter on theory, when we talked about Vygotsky, and he's the fellow that has the notion of scaffolding and says that the way we learn about the world is through interaction. So these dynamic tests are less a measure of what a child knows, but are more a measure of how a child can learn through interaction. And that seems to me to be, as a teacher, that would be what would be really interesting, what would be really useful to know, because if a child is capable of learning, as opposed to if it's difficult for a child to learn. Some of the things that predict are how you perform on IQ tests or intelligence coefficient. Of course, of the brain development, right? As we talked about previously, there's a long discussion in your textbook about the different regions of the brain. I think I read something to the effect of there is one test that indicate that at the age of 7, actually can predict, let me see if I wrote that, IQ at the age of 11 has predicted length of life and functional independence late in life. So there's some evidence that says that these tests do predict future success. Being in school, literally being in school, right? Being in an environment dedicated to learning. And of course, this is what people are concerned about now in this time after a year of shutdown when kids are not in school, that what's going to happen to children's intellectual growth. And then because I'm also a sociologist, my biggest criticism in my field has always been the cultural aspect of these intelligence tests, because that based on the kinds of questions. And so they argue that there's been some attempt to create what's called culture-free or culturally fair tests. And it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to write a test that has no reference to culture, right? But perhaps there could be tests that were more specific to culture. So it's the same thing that has been said about ACT and SAT tests, is there is a bias. And for instance, if there are questions on a test about, say, polo or tennis, right? If it's but there's not questions about, say, rolling dice or a pickup basketball game, right? Polo and tennis would be something that would be more common amongst wealthy, but poor people wouldn't have access to that. So that wouldn't be part of their culture. So the idea is that the nature of the questions that show up on any measure of intelligence has to tap into the innate or the cultural intelligence of the person. So it would be unfair, for instance, to ask an American student to take a test about using the vocabulary of say, people in England, because you wouldn't know all the phrases, you wouldn't know all the jargon, right? I think hopefully that makes sense about the culturally fair versus the culturally free test. That's always been my criticism, is that the tests are culturally biased. So there's a couple other theories of how we measure intelligence. One theory is Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence. Now, one of the criticisms of these models, they say that it doesn't really measure intelligence as maybe skills and interests. Of course, the criticisms of the one measure of intelligence, yeah. Okay. So this theory of multiple intelligence. So you've got spatial and mathematical and music and kinetic, and you can kind of read here in these boxes what that implies, right? So like a body or kinesthetic intelligence would be somebody who has knowledge of how to use their body. Somebody who has interpersonal, like an intrapersonal intelligence. One that's not discussed, at least not in this chapter or in this chapter, is emotional intelligence. We don't talk about emotional intelligence till later on. But the idea is that understanding, or being able to predict someone's intellect is indicative of how they're going to adapt or be successful in the real world. So if we can identify these gaps in a child's intellectual development and intervene, right, so that they do have the skills to be independent and successful later on in life. I don't know, it's up to you if you think this is a kind of intelligence. That might be a discussion question. And then another one that is actually, I think, referred to in another chapter, and that's this triactic theory of intelligence. I really should play these through Google before I try to say them. But it argues that intelligence, we are still talking about the sort of one measure or a single kind of intelligence, not different types, but that kind of intelligence actually has these three different qualities that intelligence has. It has a computational quality that intelligent people have the ability to analyze. It has an experimental or a creative element to it. That intelligent people have a practical or a contextual element to it. That we can't measure intelligence simply by these standardized tests, right? That is one of the assets of typical of those standardized tests on the previous slide, is that they have been rigorously tested. They're validated. They appear to measure what we think they're measuring. We come up with the same results when we use them over and over again. But these other ideas suggest that there's really that successful getting along in the adult world is not just about performing well on a standardized test. Yes, being able to analyze things, that is important, but there are other parts, there are other ways of being that are important for our ultimate success. The ability to analyze, to think creatively, and the ability to apply what we know to the particular context. And I'm going to stop right there with this one. And in the next one, I'll talk about language and literacy.